Good morning. Um, it's wanting to do this, realizing it's a bit of a challenge to work around young children that love to make lots of noise. So maybe it might be best for me to do these things or do these readings early in the morning when they're all asleep. So that's what I'm doing today. I wanted to pick up where we left off at the end of Genesis chapter 20. We read about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Isaac being promised to Abraham and Sarah a year's time from then, as well as the interaction between Abraham lying to Abimelech. So let's get started. We'll start in chapter 21, verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. At the time of which God had spoken to him, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So we know that Abraham was 100 years old. If we go back to chapter 17, we learn that Sarah was 90 years old. She was about 90 years old, because if we go back to chapter 17, this is before Sodom and Gomorrah. God promises Abraham a son, and Abraham says, how is this possible when I'm 100 and Sarah's 90? But that was about a year ago. So it sounds to me that in chapter 17 there was a little bit of generalization. He was just generalizing about how old they are. For example, ever since I turned 40, my wife, every year on my birthday from the time I turned 40, tells me I'm almost 50. You're almost 50. You're almost 50. So it could have been just a generalization of their age. But we learn here that it's very specific. It says that Abraham was 99. So Sarah was somewhere around 90 years old. She was approximately 10 years younger than Abraham. So we need to keep that in mind as we go forward, because it's interesting that in some places the age of Sarah and Abraham are mentioned. In some places it's not. So let's continue. Verse 4. Verse 6. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. God protects. So verse 8. And then the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Now, if you go back, when Isaac was born, Abraham was 86. So if Abraham's 100 years old now, or 99 years old, Isaac would have been 13 years old when Ishmael would have been 13 years old when Isaac was born. Now, Abraham is throwing a huge feast to celebrate Isaac being weaned from his mother, from nursing. And this is actually not that uncommon of a tradition. We don't do that here in the West. But the time I spent in Korea, one of the biggest celebrations people had wasn't their birthday. It was their 100th day. When a baby became 100 days old, they would always throw a huge party, a huge celebration, because if a baby makes it to 100 days old, they're likely to grow up to be young men or young women and reach adulthood. So if Abraham is weaned, just doing some basic math, we're guessing that he's probably 2 or 3 years old, because that's when babies naturally tend to wean themselves, or mothers wean their babies in third world countries. So at this point, we can assume that Abraham was 103, 102, 103. Sarah was 92, 93, and Isaac at this time would have been 16 or 17, somewhere around there. He would have been in his late teens. So continuing, in verse 9, but Sarah saw that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, who she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be the heir to my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham, and on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the body, or because of the boy, and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for though Isaac shall your offspring be named, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman, also because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now we know that oftentimes there's kind of a negative stigma that comes with the descendants of Ishmael. But Abraham loved his son. He absolutely adored his son Ishmael. In fact, before Isaac was born, Abraham thought that Ishmael would be the promised offspring that God had spoken about. And God visited Abraham and told him, no, Ishmael is not going to be the son through which my covenant is going to come through. But I will give you another son. And at that time he had promised, Abraham to have a son through Sarah. But God says here that, or Abraham says here that you can see that he absolutely loved his son Ishmael, and this pained his heart to have to send Ishmael away. Verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of my child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness at Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So here we see that God has plans for Ishmael. And there's, at this time, it was considered great wealth to have children. That was where your wealth came from, was the size of your family. And so God promises to Hagar that he's going to make Ishmael a great nation. And it's interesting to know that at this point, based on the math that we did in the Bible, that Ishmael would have been, we don't know how long after Isaac was weaned that Sarah sent Hagar into the wilderness. But Ishmael, again, would have been in his late teens. He would have been a young man. But God made a promise to Abraham that all of his offspring, all of his posterity would become the nations of the earth, would be blessed by the nations. Verse 22. At the time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore, swear to me here by God that you shall not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, you will deal with me in the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. Now, I want to go back. I'm sorry. God heard Ishmael crying. Could Ishmael have been praying to God? Because Abraham absolutely raised Ishmael to be a man of God. Raised him in the ways of the Lord, just like he did Isaac. So Ishmael would have had a strong faith or a strong belief that God was very active in his life. And then we see here that Abraham continued to have a relationship with Abimelech, and they had a very, from that time forward, they had a relationship that they respected each other very much, and we'll see that here. Because Abimelech recognized that God is with Abraham, and he recognized this when Abraham entered his city with Sarah and lied to him. Verse 25, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, so Abraham's accusing Abimelech or his servants of taking control of a well that Abraham dug. I do not know who has done this thing, says Abimelech. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. So Abimelech was willing to say, okay, well let's settle this here in a civil fashion and be in agreement with this. Because in these days, a well was something that somebody could have fought over and died over. And the two men made a covenant. Verse 28. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? Now Abimelech, you got to understand that Abimelech was very wealthy. He was a king of a city. And Abraham's giving him 7 lambs. That's not that much. I mean, that's really not that much or that much value. I'm sure that Abimelech had thousands of lambs. But it's a symbol of what it is. He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because there were both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a turmeric tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. And it might be that this is just backstory. This may not be chronologically taking place after Hagar is sent away with Ishmael, but it's giving backstory that's saying Hagar found a well in Beersheba, and then the narrator saying, this is the same Beersheba where Abraham and Abimelech struck a peace deal. Now we're going to get to the really good stuff. Chapter 22. And see, again, all we know at this point, the last timestamp that we've received is that Abraham was weaned. And again, we guesstimated that probably would have been around, Abraham would have been 102, 103, somewhere around there. After these things, chapter 22, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, who you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from far. So the Bible is always giving us hints as to geography and distances. And right here we see that where Mount Moriah is, which they've found now, they've since found. I'm talking about archaeologists. And not archaeologists, historians. It took him 3 days. So on the 3rd day, he can see the mountain afar off. So it's safe to say that it took him about 4 days to get to Mount Moriah, where he was going. And I'm sure Abraham was deeply concerned, because we know that he struggled with giving up Ishmael, and now God's asking, Ishmael's gone, and now God is asking him to give up Isaac, the promised child that God covenanted with him. And now Isaac's 103 or 4. Sarah's 93 or 4. Could God bring Abraham another son? Absolutely. But I think Abraham actually had concern about this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Verse 3, chapter 22, verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took verse 4. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took his hand and the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. Now, here's something that's very key. Abraham put the wood on his son. So, obviously his son was the stronger of the two for his son to bear the wood. Now, there's going to be a lot of symbolism that's going to take place here. So just keep in mind that Isaac bears the wood. He's carrying the sacrificial wood. So it's safe to say that Isaac, and most scholars believe that Isaac may have been well into his teens and may have actually been had the strength to overpower his father if he needed to. Now again, that's just speculation, because we don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us how old Isaac was or how old Abraham was when this takes place. But it's safe to think that Isaac was if he was strong enough to carry the wood, he could have potentially been strong enough to overpower his father. And verse 7, and Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father, he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now there's some pseudepigraphal sources that say that Abraham, when he bound his son, that Isaac asked Abraham to tie him up in fear that when it comes time to sacrifice, Isaac would overpower his father and not submit. So Isaac, according to some sources, asks his father to tie him up so that fear won't overcome him. When they came to the verse 13. No. Verse 12. He said, "Do not lay your hand." No, I'm sorry. Verse 10. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went up and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I am sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, you have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is in the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother." We'll stop there for a second. So symbolic, Isaac's sacrifice is very symbolic of Jesus. Like I said before, everything in the Old Testament points towards Jesus. It's no coincidence that Isaac bore his own sacrificial wood to the mountain where he would be sacrificed, just as Jesus bore his own cross to the mountain where he would be crucified. And there's three tests going on simultaneously with Abraham sacrificing his son. First of all is Abraham, because yes, God has promised Abraham on a number of occasions that his posterity would be like the stars in the sky, the sands of the sea. But Abraham struggled to believe him. We know that because on two occasions after receiving these promises, Abraham lied to Pharaoh and lied to Abimelech about Sarah being his wife. Now we know that technically it wasn't a lie, because Sarah was his half-sister. But the intent, Abraham was afraid of these people, was afraid of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, was afraid of Abimelech and his people, that they would kill him for Sarah's sake, in order to have Sarah as their wife. Rather than placing his trust in God and knowing that God has promised him an offspring, therefore nothing could come against him. So God is now testing Abraham, saying, okay, I've made all these promises to you, and yet you still have not fully submitted to me and believed me. And now that Abraham has his son as the one thing that God has promised him, God wants to know if Abraham was willing to submit wholly and completely to him. And so he asked Abraham, God asked Abraham for the one thing that that Abraham loved most, and that was his son Isaac. The promise that was given to him. And Abraham was willing to do it. And now you can also say that Abraham was testing God. That up to this point, Abraham had feared God's promise to some extent. And finally, Abraham decides, you know what? I'm going to completely trust God. I'm going to listen to him and do exactly what he says without fear, and trust in him that he will deliver. And he does. At the last minute, Abraham is willing to go through it. We know that Abraham had the knife in his hand, was in the process of taking Isaac's life, and God stopped him. But there's another test, and that would be with Isaac. This would be for Isaac to see, very similar with Abraham, that God will provide. God will always keep his side of the promise. It showed Isaac the importance of submitting himself completely to the Lord. So yeah. Now, in verse 20, it starts out, and we hear about a little bit more genealogy, and there's a reason why we'll hear this. Now, after these things, it was told to Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz, his firstborn, Buz, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Fildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. So we're learning who Rebekah, or where Rebekah comes from. And for those of you who are not familiar, we'll read who Rebekah is, but we find out who Rebekah is. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, this concubine, whose name was Rumah, bore Tebah, Gam, Tahash, and Maah. So Abraham sees all around him large families, and he only has his one son. So it's not significant that Abraham is willing to sacrifice Isaac with only a promise. Now, that was a promise from God. You can take that to the bank. But he did it on a promise. He did it understanding that God would provide, and we will see through, as we proceed through Isaac and Jacob, that God always does. God always intercedes and provides when we're in need. But it's often over and over and over. It's us that doubt. It's us that doubt God's promise. We doubt God's word, and yet He still upholds His side of His promises. So with that, I would encourage you to go in and dive in and just read some more about Abraham and Isaac. There's a lot of beautiful symbolism there. And I would encourage you to be like Abraham. We read in James that Abraham's actions, when God told him to sacrifice Isaac, that his actions were righteous before God, were counted to him for righteousness. So I encourage you to go and do and be about God's work, because it will be counted to you for righteousness. With that, have a wonderful day, and we will catch you on the other side on Sabbath, coming very soon.